Okay, so our first project, we're going to do a basic animation, and we want to make, in the end, this pretty awesome scene with a red bouncing ball. So hopefully it'll look something like this, but by the end of this first video, it'll probably look like this. Okay, so let's get started. So in Blender, we're going to delete our cube. Let me put on my screencast keys. So X to delete, confirm. We're going to add a sphere. And by default, it comes in with flat shading. So in your tool panel, if you hit smooth shading, it's in the tool tab, it'll smooth it out. And then we can close this tab because we don't really need it much anymore just by hitting T, and we'll scroll up on this is our properties window with N. This tells us where our ball is in the scale. So let's go to our front view, and we're going to want our ball to fall. But before we do that, this origin point where it scales to, we want to move that. So if you go into edit mode, you could just hit tab. We're in edit mode now. Like, drag it up on the Z so the origin is at the bottom of the ball. And now go back to object mode. Now if we scale on the Z axis, it'll squash to that point like it's hitting the ground. So we're going to zoom out, and we want our ball to start falling. Let's just say right about there is good, which in our location it's about 9 units. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But we'll just round it out. It doesn't have to be exact. And if we want to insert keyframes into that property, if you hit I, it inserts in all the properties X, Y, Z, but since we only care about the Z, I'm going to undo that with Control Z, and I'm going to right click and say insert single keyframe. This is just going to keep it cleaner in the future. So let's see what this keyframe actually looks like. It's right there. It's that yellow line. So I'm going to move this timeline up and split the view and go to the Dopesheet. So now you can see we have basically we've made one keyframe, but it shows up 4 times. It shows up, there's a keyframe in the summary. We don't need that. But it's just saying the sphere has a keyframe in the Z location. So we'll leave that open. So let's go ahead to frame 10. I'm just right clicking and dragging this green cursor, or you can go down here and type in 10. And let's have it land on the ground. Well, really, we should just say 0. And I'm going to hit I now. Because we have one property selected, now we can just hit I. And then let's go to frame 20. And it was at 9 units, so we'll go to like 8 units because it shouldn't bounce as high. It loses energy. And then we'll go ahead to 30 and go back down to 0. So let's see what animation we have. You can just skip back here. I prefer the shortcut Shift left arrow, and then hit play. So we have a ball that kind of is moving, but it doesn't really look like it's bouncing. It looks like it's floating in water or bouncing in water. So to fix that, I'm going to move this up a bit, the Dopesheet, and I'm going to split it again. So now we have our Dopesheet down here. I'm going to go to the graph editor, and we can see our Z location. It has this weird curve. So this is interpolation types. In the keyframe settings, if you go to interpolation type, most programs do linear by default, which is just a constant speed. By default, Blender does Bezier, which is what we want, but we want it to slowly fall out of that point because gravity has acceleration, and then when it hits, it's going really fast, and then when it bounces back, it's really fast, but then it slows down. So to do that, there's a couple ways. You can grab these handles and grab them with G and move them. I'm going to grab this handle with G, and then I'm going to hit X. So it just moves on the X axis, and so that means it's going to slowly leave this point, and then it's like getting faster and faster because the curve is like basically vertical. And let's pull this curve in a bit, so it's super fast. We'll pull this curve in a bit, so it's going to leave that quickly. And I'm just going to grab the middle keyframe, scale it on the X, which pretty much does the same thing as grabbing, and bring this in. So now we have a more of an arc. What does this look like? Boing. Okay, so we have like a great bounce. Now, because it bounced once that high, it makes sense that it would keep bouncing. But we don't have to keep inserting keyframes. What we can do is select the high point and the low point, and we're going to duplicate it and just shift it over. So to duplicate is Shift D, and then I'm going to hit X to keep it on that X axis. So now let's see what it looks like. I'm going to move it back one. Boing, boing. So there's an awkward bounce now because it's like losing energy and then it like gains energy because it shouldn't. We see it lose energy here. You know, it's at this height and then it loses height. We expect it to keep going down, but instead it goes up. So let's just grab this key point, move it down, and move it over. And let's pull this over. And pull this over, because each bounce we want it to get basically smaller. So let's just watch it just to see. Boing, boing. Probably even lower. So really, animation isn't an exact science. I'm going to pause the recording here, but I'm going to keep grabbing these and duplicating them until it, and keep shrinking them down. So maybe I won't pause the video, we'll just see. Yeah, so it looks a little awkward to me. I'm going to pause and try to clean. Okay, so I think it looks better now. A couple things I did. I just made sure that these points were scaled in so that the energy in is the same as the out. I also made sure that the curves were relatively symmetrical, so you don't want a curve that looks like that or like that. But now here's what it looks like. So boing, 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 boing. So I'm going to add just a couple more bounces. And it also loses energy on the x-axis. It doesn't take as long for it to go up to its height and down. So I'm going to bring these in. And this might be, well, it should probably bounce more, but this might be good enough for our purposes. Okay, we'll call that good. So the other thing, to add more personality, right now it's like a hard basketball. So if you're going for realism, this might be good enough, but we want to give it some personality. So we want it to, as it accelerates to this point, we're going to scale it on the z-axis. Oops, that's rotation. So scroll down, we're going to scale it on the sorry, before we scale it, let's set a keyframe at 0.1. I mean at the first frame. Insert a single keyframe by right-clicking. So at that height, it's just a normal because it's at 0 acceleration. But as it accelerates, we're going to add a new keyframe. Green just means this is a keyframed property, but it's not keyframed at this frame yet. So we'll stretch it to like, let's do 1.3 and 1.2. And I'm going to hit I. So then I'm going to just right click. When it hits the ground, we'll do like 0.8. And then it bounces back. We'll go back to 1.2. So the idea is it's accelerating and it reaches that amount of energy. So it's getting stretched and then it hits the ground. It stores that energy or whatever. And then it's going to bounce back with an equal opposite. It should technically be a little less, like 1.9. Oops. Like 1.19. But let's not get too nitpicky. So then when it gets up to its peak, it's not scaled at all. It's just back to its default of 1. And then it's going to accelerate again, but it's not as accelerating as far because it's already lost some energy. And then it hits, it's not going to squash. as much, so like 0.85, and then 1.15, and then 0, oops, not 0, 1 is the default. 0 would be like invisible. Then let's just do 1.1, hits the ground. Let's do 0.9, 1.1. Mm, 1.05, 0.95. So as you can see, we're losing a lot of energy. And then, I mean, really, maybe there's no squash or stretch for the last one. So now it kind of looks like this. And these little handles, if you want to get rid of them, these are your manipulators. You can just click that to hide them. Or if you hit A to deselect everything, that also hides them. But you might lose if you if you unselect everything. If you have this thing checked, which includes only, it means you want to show the curves of what you have selected. By unselecting everything, there's nothing, so you can just uncheck that if you want to keep your curves seen. So I'd say that's a successful ball animation. To render out a preview of this, so let's set up our camera real quick. I'm going to close this by joining areas. So let's go back to the front view. A shortcut I love is camera to selected position. I'm going to hit spacebar, camera, align camera to view, and it's Control Alt number pad 0, and I just think that feels good. So hit Control Alt number pad 0. And now our camera is kind of in the front view, but we can't quite see it hit the ground, right? So if you want to go into first person mode, if you hit Shift F, now you can use the ASDW keys. So if I hit S, I'm like backing up like it's a first person shooter. W brings you forward. If you hold Shift, it's like running while you do that. So I just backed up, and then left click to select. So this, we can see everything in our frame. Let's add a plane, and let's scale that plane up, and just hit play. Boing, boing, boing. So if you want to render this out, because maybe like our frame rates, they're at like 24. This is full speed really, but like if your animation's more complex and you want to see what it'll actually play like, you could make a little MPEG video, set the encoding to MP4, and set your output folder to like the desktop. And we're just going to render this little preview. So these little things will show up unless you, which is no problem, unless you go to display and hit only render, and then you turn off your little transform controls. So now go to render, and we don't need it this long. Like right now it's 250 frames, which is like 10 seconds. So go to like frame 100. You can set the end here by saying frame 100. Or you could, in this timeline, hit E for end frame. So go, and then go render, OpenGL render animation. So now if I go to the desktop, I see our bouncing ball. One thing to keep in mind, the quality looks a little pixelated because we had it set to 1920 by 1080, which is HD, but it's at 50%. So if I set it to there, hit animate, oop, not animate, OpenGL render animation. So it's a little slower. But now if I go here, it should look, yeah, now it's an HD preview. Okay, so for the next video, we're going to spice that up a bit. But I'd recommend taking a short break, get up, stretch your legs, walk around, and we'll see you in a bit.